Hey guys, Trevor with Shadow Systems, and today we're going to do a breakdown of the frame, specifically the trigger pack. So this is for those of you that are interested in working on the gun or have some reason to disassemble the frame. Please keep in mind this is not something we recommend you do unless you're very comfortable with it. If you're not, it should be something that you have a gunsmith do, or you can always, of course, send the gun back to us. I have a flat dark earth MR920 here that we'll be using as our pistol today. I thought the flat dark earth color might help with some contrast to be easier to see the parts. Okay, so let's first disassemble the gun, the same as you normally would when you field strip. You're removing the frame and you'll set aside the slide. There are at least one and possibly two tools that you'll need today. One is a 3/32 size punch. There are many tools out there in the market that will do that for you. And then you might need, especially if the gun is very new, you might need a hammer. We of course recommend one that is rubberized so that you won't damage anything. But this is an inexpensive dead blow hammer. They sell them at a lot of different places. Okay, so there are 3 pins that we're going to be looking at as we disassemble this frame. We have what's called the locking block pin up here, the trigger axis pin below it, the larger of the two, and then over here is the trigger mech housing pin, okay? All 3 of those will need to be removed. Whenever you're removing pins from one of the frames, you should always plan to go left to right. So if I'm shooting the pistol, I'm pushing on the left side of the frame, so the camera side in this case. The first pin we're going to remove is the larger of the 2 here, so the trigger axis pin, and it is retained by the spring pressure of the slide release lever. The slide release lever is actually locking that pin in place. So what you do is, before applying pressure to this pin, you need to essentially wiggle your slide release lever up and down a little bit until such time as the pin releases. And at a certain moment, it'll come right through. You really shouldn't need to push too hard or hammer on it or anything like that. All right, you'll pull the slide release lever out immediately, and now you have 2 pins remaining in the frame. You really can remove either of them. I usually remove the trigger housing, the locking block pin next. So again, I'm gonna push from this side. It's actually less important for this pin which direction you go, but I'll push from this side for consistency. This one's usually a little tighter. You have to overcome the locking effect that the locking block has on this pin. So you'll push it all the way through the frame and it will come out the other side. This is called a locking block, this metal component here. It is now free. You can take your tool and just gently lift on it. Again, if the gun is new, that could be very, very tight. So just be aware of that and use caution if you're prying on it, because you don't want to mar the frame there, okay? The locking block then lifts out, and we have only 1 pin remaining to remove. It's in the back now. So the trigger housing pin, we're going to push again from one side of the frame all the way through. Now that pin is out. Okay, so I've removed all 3 pins and the locking block and the slide release lever at this point. Now I can just grab the ejector and lift up, and the entire trigger assembly will come out. Okay, so this is the firing system that actually actuates the striker and fires the gun. This one's pretty dirty, so you'll have to forgive me for that, but we're going to remove the trigger from the housing assembly first. And it's a little bit of an awkward movement. What we're trying to do is pull the housing forward, pull the trigger forward and then twist it up and out. And there's kind of a certain angle when it very easily releases from the housing. So I'm just gonna kind of gently pull it forward a little bit like this, and then I'm gonna twist it until it pops up and out. And you'll see that the housing is now below the trigger and it's just hanging there by the spring, okay? It's pretty self-explanatory how the trigger comes off. You just have to get it off the hook. And then now there's essentially 3 components remaining. We have the connector, we have the housing itself, and then we have the trigger return spring, okay? Please make note of the trigger return spring. That spring is actually the one that most people have trouble with when they're reassembling the gun. Either they put the spring in upside down or they have it out of place when the gun is assembled, and I'll show you that in a moment. But take note of how it's installed, the direction that the hook is going, all right? And we'll look at that again in a second. Okay, we're gonna remove the connector next. Now, conveniently, on the back of the housing, there is an opening for your punch. So you can apply pressure on the back of the connector and it will just kind of pop out like that. So you push on the back of it, here comes your connector. Just to show you again, that hole right there can be used to push the component all the way through, okay? Great. So now if you did need to replace the trigger spring, you're going to essentially twist the spring over, kind of pop it over, and then it will come off. Now, here's our moment. The spring's hook, when you are reinstalling a trigger return spring, you are hooking the spring down toward the housing, okay? Down toward the housing, never up, always down. If you hook the spring down toward the housing, then when you flip it over to the other side, it'll be in the correct position, okay? All right, down toward the housing when you're installing it, like a hook. Okay, all right, so now let's go ahead and reassemble the rest of it. So we would take our connector. When you put your connector in, you need to make sure that it is seated all the way. So you'll press it into place like that, and then I recommend setting it flat on your bench and just applying some pressure downward with your tool right at that location to make sure it's seated. Next, we have our trigger. So we're gonna let that spring hang down, and we're gonna grab it with our trigger in that hole that's on the bottom of the spring leg. So I've grabbed the trigger, and now they're back together as one unit. Okay, putting the trigger in place is again where people get a little stuck. Again, the spring is the trickiest part. So you're gonna pull forward and then twist again like you did the time before. All right, so when it's installed correctly, it will be under spring tension, and it'll be kind of pulled against the connector, and it'll sort of wobble around a little bit, but you'll at least feel that spring force pulling back toward the connector. After you install it, look underneath the housing. Look in this hole. If you can see the hook of the spring cocked off to one side, then the spring is out of place. The purpose of pulling it forward is to keep that spring seated in the groove. You don't want it off to the side. You want it in that groove. So you hook the spring in the groove, you pull it forward to maintain tension, and then you roll it in, and then you check. So there, I can see my little spring leg is centered, and I know it's put together right. After that, it's pretty easy. You reinsert the trigger housing, you reinsert the locking block, you can put the trigger mech housing pin back in. Now, an important point here, we really recommend applying firm downward pressure when installing this pin, okay? So you need to have that downward pressure to seat the housing into the frame. If you try to pound it in like this, you may have a little misalignment and you could break that pin. So a little bit of downward pressure. You can use the back of a tool, but in this case, I'll use the hammer, again, the soft side, to just give it a couple taps and tap it in, okay? And you're looking to have that pin be reasonably centered side to side. You can use the back of the tool to help you center it if you need to, okay? So now my pin is centered. Next, we're going to install our locking block pin. So that locking block pin, of course, is the smaller of the two pins, and we're going to install it either with a hammer or just with some pressure. I'll use the hammer in this case. Give it a tap. And again, you'll want to apply a little pressure with the corner of your tool, and it should click and kind of seat in place, okay? Next, you'll install your slide release lever. You want to make sure that you stick it on the far left side of that trigger, and it will slide into a little slot that you can see inside the frame. So now that's in place, and if you look through the trigger house or the trigger axis pin hole now, which that pin is still missing, you can see how everything is lining up, and you can then, ensure it is aligned as you install the pin. This pin is the one that's important, so we pushed it out from the left side of the frame. We're going to install it from the right side of the frame, and it just makes it a little easier. So I've got it lined up, and I'm going to push it until it seats and clicks. So let's listen to that. That went all the way through until it seats and clicks. There. So now it's locked in place, and I will again center that pin. Okay, so now we have reassembled our frame. The last thing we're going to do is, I would recommend shining a flashlight down in that hole, because that's where that spring is we were looking at earlier, and you just want to make sure that it's still centered. So you can shine a little light down in front of the trigger bar, and if you'll see that that spring is cocked off to one side, then it obviously moved as you installed it. The good news is you can usually use your punch or any other kind of thin instrument and stick it down there and pop it back in place so that you don't have to take the whole frame apart. Once it's in place, it'll stay there. Okay? All right, well, I hope that was helpful. We'll be doing some more of these, so be on the lookout for other sections of the gun covered in other videos. Thank you.